For today's video, I have finally gotten my hands on the new 2021 Nissan Rogue at home, so obviously this video is going to have the official score section and a complete detailed comparison section. But as we take a look around the Nissan Rogue, it's hard not to talk about the bestseller in the segment, the Toyota RAV4, so that's why there is a very blue RAV4 parked right behind this car. If you want to know how the Rogue and the RAV4 stack up a little bit more directly, there's going to be a separate video where I take a deep dive into Rogue versus RAV4. Be sure and check that one out. Although this Rogue is all new, the design doesn't really depart too far from the previous generation Rogue, and that's not a bad thing, because the Rogue's always been a relatively handsome entry in this segment, and the new chiseled, sharper lines that we find in the 2021 Rogue, I think, bring it up to one of the better looking options. I like the look of the Toyota RAV4, but I do think that this is a more attractive front end in the segment. This has the divorced headlamp arrangement that we've seen in a number of Hyundai and Kia models lately, although I think it's executed a little bit better in the Rogue. This top strip right here is an accent light and the turn signal. You can see it blinking over there on that side. At the bottom, we have full LED headlights in all versions of the Rogue. At the bottom of the bumper, we have LED fog lights. This is a platinum trim of the Rogue. Keep that in mind as we take a look around. So this does have all of the options like the front parking sensors, radar adaptive cruise control, etc. Standard LED headlights are getting pretty popular for new cars in America, but there are two different kinds of LED headlights that we generally see out there. There are reflector lights like we see in the Rogue and projector headlights like we see in the RAV4. Let me know which one you prefer down there in the comment section. Be sure and let me know what you think about the format of this video down there in the comment section. Is it weird that there's a Smurf blue RAV4 lurking in the background? Or does it make sense because the RAV4 is the best seller in this segment, so clearly there need to be a few comparisons. For 2021, the Rogue is 183 inches long. This isn't quite as long as the last generation Rogue, but part of that is because the front end and back end have been chiseled a little bit, so that way things are a bit more practical in terms of their overall space utilization. This is longer than the RAV4. The RAV4 is just about 181 inches long, and that's one of the reasons that we get more interior room in the Rogue. The wheelbase is also about an inch longer as well. When you take a look at the sales charts, the RAV4, the CRV, the Rogue, and the Equinox are the four best-selling things that are not pickup trucks. So when redesigning a model in this segment, it's important that they don't alienate customers. So the Rogue still looks a lot like the previous generation, and there's nothing really weird about its styling. It's not going out in any crazy direction like you do see in some of the poorer selling crossovers out there. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if you are looking for a crossover with a lot more personality than you find in the top four, you probably want to take a look sort of towards the bottom of the sales chart. The rear tail lamp modules are partial LED modules, so the turn signals and the backup lights, even in this trim, are not LEDs. We find something very similar in pretty much all of the competition, except for entries like the Mazda CX-5, which does have a full LED rear end. The Rogue has a much more vertical hatch than we find in some of those style-forward entries, and that's one of the reasons that the cargo area is so practical. I'll go into greater detail in just a moment, but the Rogue does have one of the largest cargo areas in this segment. At least for the moment, in the United States, all Rogues will have just one engine option. It's a 2.5-liter four-cylinder naturally aspirated engine producing 181 horsepower and 181 pound-feet of torque. The previous generation Rogue's hybrid system has not made a return at this time. This engine is mated to just one transmission. It's a continuously variable automatic transmission, and you have the option of all-wheel drive. The model that I'm driving today is the front-wheel drive version, and this gets 30 miles per gallon combined. If you do choose all-wheel drive, you lose 1 mile per gallon in the combined cycle. This engine may produce less horsepower than we find in the regular version of the RAV4, but the torque number is just about the same. And thanks to the CVT, this Rogue ends up being actually a little bit faster than the non-hybrid version of the RAV4. That surprised me a little bit because when I first drove this down in Southern California, it was nearly a second slower than the time that I got up here at home. That's one of the reasons that I like to bring new vehicles like this back after I've driven them at a launch event, because oftentimes they don't have the final software for the transmission or the engine, or it's a pre-production vehicle entirely, so I do like to get them home and run them through our official battery of tests here so I can have 0 to 60 times and 60 to 0 times that are as fair as possible, driven on the same surface, etc. Front seat comfort is excellent in the latest version of the Rogue, although I do wish the seat was a hair more adjustable. We have a two-way adjustable lumbar support, not a four-way adjustable lumbar support, and even in this top-end trim, we don't have things like an extending thigh cushion. That may sound like an odd thing to ask for in a vehicle in this price category, but remember there are a few options out there, like a Hyundai Santa Fe, that aren't too far off top-end versions of the Rogue and would give you that additional functionality. We have a tilt telescopic steering column. It's manual, but it has a decent range of motion, and we have a two-position seat memory over there for the driver. In this top-end trim, the passenger seat is powered, but it does not have the two-way lumbar that we find on the driver's side. Aside from wishing the seat had four-way lumbar, I find the design of this seat to be incredibly comfortable, much more comfortable than the RAV4 or the CR-V's front seats. That's all down to Nissan's zero-gravity design. It's a fancy way of saying that the seat's just very ergonomic. If I were picking a compact crossover for a road trip and I was going to spend 6, 7, or 8 hours behind the wheel at a time, the Rogue would probably be my first pick. The Rogue has long been one of the roomiest compact crossovers, and that continues for 2021. Although surprisingly, the combined legroom figures have shrunk ever so slightly from the previous generation Rogue. It still means that if you are trying to mix adults up front, especially taller adults, and rear-facing child seats in the rear, it's going to be a lot easier to do that in the Rogue than something like the RAV4. With the front seat comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I still have about 6 inches of legroom left. With this front seat adjusted for a 6'5" passenger, I still have about 3 inches of legroom left. The Rogue also has a slightly more upright seating position both front and rear. That's something that I seem to prefer. And there's a little bit more thigh support because these seat bottom cushions are a little bit higher off the ground than we find in some of the competition. Thanks to the boxy proportions, headroom is very generous in the Rogue. Sitting back here, I have about 2 inches of headroom left. The rear seats, however, do not offer any recline. They simply fold flat like this and completely flat with the upper section of the cargo area in the back, but no recline functionality like we find in some of the competition. Bearing in mind that this is the top-end trim, there are a few touches back here we don't find in some of the other options, like integrated sunshades in the rear doors, and 3-zone automatic climate control, 3-stage heated rear seats, and charge-only ports for the rear passengers. Cargo space and cargo practicality are 2 solid reasons to buy the Rogue over many of its direct competition. Behind this hatch, we find just under 40 cubic feet of storage space. That's easily enough room to accommodate 6 24-inch roller bags in my 24-inch roller bag test, and Nissan still has a version of their divide and hide cargo solution here, although this is honestly not as practical as we found in the last generation Rogue. With the last generation Rogue, not only could you remove these cargo dividers, but you could also put them on a second tier in the cargo area, and that really helped improve cargo practicality because you could have, for instance, a birthday cake on one tier and some of the other party supplies below. It was a very practical touch that we don't find in this generation. A touch back here that I appreciate is that we have a release for the rear seat backs, not just on the rear seats themselves, but also back here in the cargo area. That is, for instance, a touch that we don't find in the RAV4. Going further under the load floor, we find a compact spare tire and the subwoofer for the audio system right there. If you didn't plan on using any of this additional underfloor load space, you could put a full-size spare tire under there if you wanted to. Clearly, this generation of the Rogue is going to have to lose some points in the exclusive AOA Trunk Comfort Index because we no longer have that tiered storage system. But we still have a divide and hide cargo system of some sorts with some extra storage space under these 2 load sections right here, the ability to divide the cargo area up a little bit, and we have that spare tire under there and enough room to put a full-size spare if you want to aftermarket. The cargo area is also large and square, which definitely helps bring this some points. I'm going to give it 9 out of 10 points overall because of the lack of that divide and hide storage system. As we take a spin around the interior, remember that we are in the very top-end trim, so obviously there are going to be things in here that you don't find in the base model. This one has the large panoramic moonroof that I mentioned earlier. It goes to just over the rear passenger's laps. We have height-adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger and 2-way adjustable headrests. Something that surprised me with this generation of the Rogue is that even though this top-end trim has perforated leather sections for the seat bottom and seat back cushion, these seats are just heated. They're not ventilated like we do find in some of the competition. If you're a larger driver or larger front passenger, you'll be happy to know that the bolstering is not terribly extreme, and these seats do feel a little bit wider than some of the competition. So if you're looking for a roomier front seat experience, this might be something that you should look at. The front and rear doors have very similar designs, but the front doors have more soft touch materials than we find in the back. Soft touch upper section, midsection there, and a very soft armrest. We do find harder plastics down there towards the bottom of the door, and there is a small ambient lighting strip between the brown upper section of the door and that charcoal midsection of the door. You can get either monotone or the 2-tone interiors depending on the trim level of the Rogue that you get. This is again the top end trim, so we have this brown on black interior combo in this particular model. There's also an insert right down here that is imitation wood trim. It looks like open pore wood trim and the look is incredibly believable, but when you actually touch it, it's smooth. So it's one way to know that it's not actually real. We have a stitch section right there of the dashboard, and then in the middle of the dash, we have your choice of 2 different infotainment systems. There's a standard 8-inch touchscreen infotainment system or this optional 9-inch touchscreen infotainment system. Android Auto and Apple CarPlay support is standard on all versions of the Rogue. Wireless Apple CarPlay is available as well. We have some physical buttons below the screen, so if you're not a fan of touch buttons, then this will make you a little bit happier there. We have dual zone automatic climate control behind that for the driver and front passenger. There's also, again, that rear zone. You can see the sync right there for the rear zone. Below that, we have 2 USB inputs for the system. one USB-C and one regular USB. This is where we find the engine start-stop button. I did find that location a little bit odd. We have a wireless charging mat there, and then we have a joystick-style shifter that always returns to center. There's a lock-unlock button there, pull down for drive, push forward for reverse, and then park is the button on top. We have two large cup holders right there, electric parking brake, auto brake hold, and then a drive mode selector. This has a different texture than that imitation wood trim that we found over there on the dashboard, but if we go in for an even closer look, we do find a little bit more of that imitation wood trim right down there in that section of the dash. The center console opens in a bifold fashion right like that. This is a pretty accommodating storage area, and it has a little fixed area right there for keys or some other small items like coins, that sort of thing. One of the reasons for the joystick style shifter is that it debulks the dashboard and it gives us room for an under center console storage area where you could put purses, tablet computers, smartphones, that sort of thing right there in that under shelf. One of the most anticipated features in the new Rogue is this full LCD instrument cluster that you'll find in the most expensive models. Nissan did an excellent job with the graphics and the animations. This display is definitely really snappy. However, we don't have anything like a moving map display like you do find in modern Audis with their disco dashboard or in certain Volkswagen models. However, large portions of the display are configurable. You can choose, for instance, what's happening over there inside the tachometer. You can also use the display to change your audio source. There's a meter that'll pop up there. You can change your driver assistance settings, change your personal display options. You can change your meter view, for instance, if you want a more traditional display right there. But the display theme does not change based on your drive mode. So if I move over to Sport, we don't get anything like a blazing red display or anything along those lines. Another feature that we don't find in all the competition is a full color heads-up display. It is a little bit tricky to film, of course, but we do have features like infotainment readouts, status of the radar, adaptive cruise control, turn-by-turn navigation directions, and of course the speedometer in the middle. Nissan loves flat-bottom steering wheels, so we find one of those in the Rogue, although this is not as aggressive of a flat bottom as we find in some of the other Nissans. It has sport grips up top. This particular one is leather-wrapped, and we have nice thin spokes on the sides with a split bottom spoke down here. On the back of the steering wheel, we have shift paddles up on the right, down on the left. This does have a CVT, but it still has shift paddles. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of shift paddles on a car with a CVT. I think they're about as useful as shift paddles on a French Poodle. But, if you really want to play with those imitation gear ratios, then you can use the paddles on the back. Rather than making them shift paddles, I kind of wish Nissan would do something innovative, like give us constant deceleration engine braking. So, for instance, you click the paddle and it keeps the engine at, say, 5,000 RPM, and then keeps you at that particular engine RPM as you decelerate, so constantly varying the ratio. Over here on this side, we have infotainment controls, volume up, down, track, forward, backward. On this side, we have voice control, phone button, and then buttons for that radar adaptive cruise control system. This wheel and these toggles, along with this button, control that multifunction LCD. In addition to Nissan's latest steering wheel design, this generation of the Rogue also gets Nissan's latest window switches. These definitely have a more premium feel to them than the previous Rogue. I also think they feel more premium than the ones that we find in the CR-V or RAV4. In my official 0 to 60 test, the Rogue performed better than when I first drove this down in Southern California. 0 to 60 happened in this front-wheel drive model in 8.2 seconds. If you get your hands on an all-wheel drive model, it's probably going to be a little bit slower because of the added weight and the added loss. In my 60 to 0 braking test, it took 115 feet for this vehicle to stop from highway speeds back to 0, and you can thank the wide tires for that. All models of the Rogue have 235 with tires on them, which surprised me a little bit, because in a segment where fuel economy seems to be important, Nissan went a little bit wider than average. Obviously, that will have a positive effect on the braking and handling ability of the Rogue, but it will have a bit of a negative impact on road noise and on fuel economy. Speaking of handling, the Rogue has really improved in this generation. The previous generation wasn't exactly a slouch when you started pushing it, but it wasn't the kind of vehicle that really wanted to get pushed. And this generation of the Rogue is a lot more eager in that respect, and the grip levels are definitely excellent. I don't have access to a skid pad here at Alex Autos, but publications that do have put skid pad numbers approximately equal to the top-end versions of the RAV4 and CR-V. As I often say, ride and handling are two ends of the teeter-totter, and that is obvious when you drive the previous generation Rogue with the new generation Rogue back to back. Because this suspension is certainly firmer than the previous generation Rogue, and that does have an impact on the ride quality. The firmer suspension tune can also lead to some unusual feelings in the rear end of the vehicle if there's no additional weight in the car, you're just the driver, and you're driving over really broken pavement in a straight line. In my cabin noise testing at 50 miles an hour, I got 70 decibels in here, so this is one of the quieter compact crossovers that I've tested recently. This is a little bit quieter than the last RAV4. Over a week of mixed driving, I've been averaging 30.5 miles per gallon, right about what the EPA says I should be getting in this front-wheel drive model. If you got the all-wheel drive version of the Rogue, then that does drop down by 1 mpg. Keep in mind that we do have 235 with tires on all versions of the Rogue, so the fuel economy is pretty decent as far as mainstream models go. Now, clearly, if you wanted better fuel economy, economy, you could look at any of the hybrids available in this segment, and that's why I'm going to give fuel economy a B+ in this particular model. Pretty much all of the hybrids out there are targeting near 40 miles per gallon in terms of fuel economy, so they pretty much all be about 30% better than what I'm driving right here. Bottom lining the Rogue is pretty easy. This is certainly more fun than the previous generation of the Rogue, but it's not an overtly sporty crossover. Just over 8 seconds 0 to 60, it's not going to win any speed races. There's certainly going to be more powerful and faster options out there. We have the Mazda CX-5 Turbo, we have the RAV4 Prime, we have upcoming hot versions of the Hyundai Tucson as well. The best way to describe the Rogue is that it's just easy to live with. The seats are comfortable, we have enough power for passing maneuvers, not quite as much as I might like, but certainly enough to be sufficient. And when the road starts winding, the new Rogue definitely has the ability to put a smile on your face, as long as you're not really looking for something in that next category up, where we are going to see the new high-performance version of the Tucson. As I've come to expect from Nissan, the Rogue continues to sell on value. It starts at $25,650. That's not necessarily the lowest starting price in this segment, but when you take a look at the amount of feature content you get standard, you'll see that the Rogue is really a great deal. The top-end models are also not as expensive as we find in a lot of the competition. The Platinum trim is the top-end model that starts at $35,430. You can add all-wheel drive and a few things to it, but it's not going to get over $40,000 like we do find in some of the competition. And most people shopping for a Nissan Rogue are likely going to be landing somewhere between $27,000 and $34,000 out the door. When you compare the level of feature content you get in every trim of Rogue versus comparably priced competitors, you'll see that the value proposition is extremely high. The only exception there is when you start comparing this to some of the Korean options, but at the moment, most of those Korean options are going to be a lot smaller on the inside. Now, the Tucson is getting a decent redesign for 2022. It's getting a lot bigger on the inside. It's actually going to be a little bit more Rogue-sized than the previous model, but it's not on sale just yet. With that out of the way, let's dive into the competition. I'm going to be talking about the 4 best-selling compact crossovers in the US. There really isn't time to cover every crossover out there, so if you're wondering, hey, why isn't this particular model included here? That's the main reason. It's important to keep in mind when comparing vehicles in this particular segment, or really actually most crossovers out there, that crossovers are an incredibly hot segment. Sales are on fire and every manufacturer is leaping into this segment with new models, new trims, refreshes, and tons of options. So it's not too surprising that it's a little bit difficult to wade through the weeds here. The first option has to be the Toyota RAV4. This is the best-selling thing in America that is not a pickup truck. It's going to start a little bit more expensive than the Rogue for 2021 at $26,050. The RAV4 has a similar feature set when it comes to safety, but there are a few options that you'll find on the Rogue standard that are optional on the RAV4 and vice versa. So when debating between these two models, you need to decide which features are right for you, and that will really determine which vehicle might be the better fit. The big thing to know about the RAV4 in this generation is that it actually shrank inside a little bit versus the outgoing RAV4, and that means that the Rogue is going to be a lot easier to accommodate rear-facing child seats or taller people, longer-legged people inside than in the Toyota. I've had a RAV4 for a little over a year now. My particular RAV4 happens to be on sale. You can go and check out a video on that one. But the bottom line with the RAV4 is that the interior dimensions could be a little bit larger in my opinion. That's really critical if you plan on putting someone like me, a 6-foot-tall adult, in the front and a rear-facing child seat in the back. You can do that in the Rogue, you can do that in the CR-V, but it's really hard in the RAV4. This generation of the RAV4 is definitely styled differently than the previous generation. It looks a lot more truck-like if that's something that you're interested in, but it's worth noting that on the inside, materials and material quality and fit and finish didn't improve as drastically in this generation over the previous generation as we do see in the Rogue over its previous generation. So personally, I like the interior styling and the interior parts quality and the way the interior is assembled a bit more in the Rogue than in the RAV4. The seams and gaps and things like that, they just are a little bit more cohesive inside the Nissan. We also have a few options that we don't find in the RAV4, like the full LCD instrument cluster. You can also get a heads-up display, less expensive in that model than you'll find in the RAV4. The downside is that Nissan is using a less powerful engine, so we get over 200 horsepower in the RAV4, about 180 horsepower in the Nissan Rogue, and you will notice the performance difference. There's also no hybrid trim, and the hybrid trim of the RAV4 has been selling extremely well. It's representing nearly a third of RAV4 sales at this point in the United States and around the world. Now, the RAV4 Hybrid is going to be more expensive than the average Nissan Rogue, but it's possible that in the average ownership cycle of 5 to 6 years, you may end up saving money if you were to buy that RAV4 Hybrid instead. The RAV4 Hybrid's also been very reliable, and that is something that Nissan has had troubles with over the years. Depending on the years you're looking at, the Nissan has scored either a little bit above average or pretty average when it comes to reliability, but any way you slice it, the RAV4 is likely going to be more reliable. It's really difficult to talk about reliability with a brand new model. Any manufacturer out there, including Toyota, can have a misstep, but generally speaking, Toyotas are going to be more reliable than Nissans. It's also worth noting that if you don't like a continuously variable automatic transmission, the RAV4 is one of the few vehicles in this segment that does not have one. CVTs are getting very popular in pretty much every segment out there, but there are a few holdouts that use traditional automatic transmissions. Next up, we have the Honda CR-V at $35,350. It is less expensive than the Nissan Rogue starting, but we don't find the same level of feature content in that base CR-V as we do find in the Nissan Rogue. You should keep in mind that at this point, the CR-V is one of the older entries in this segment, and it's due to be replaced relatively soon. I don't have any specific details just yet, but most likely 2022 or 2023 is when we're going to find an all-new Honda CR-V. It seems like things are pushing towards 2023 at this point, however. You'll notice the CR-V's age when you take a look at the exterior design and the interior design, although I think the interior quality is definitely good in the CR-V. My main issue with the CR-V is the infotainment system. It definitely is slower and laggier than most of the infotainment systems that it competes with. The screen is a little bit smaller than average as well, and when you have a smartphone connected to it, whether it's Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, the system can sometimes freeze and crash. I've been hoping for a while that Honda will address this particular problem with this generation infotainment system, but it doesn't seem like Honda's going to do that until the CR-V gets replaced. On the other hand, the CR-V has a big roomy interior and a very large cargo area. There's also an available hybrid system, and the hybrid system has all-wheel drive. Rather than the e-all-wheel drive system that we find in the RAV4, this is a true mechanical all-wheel drive. So if you want to save on fuel and you want a real mechanical all-wheel drive system and you don't want a Ford product, this is going to be one of the few options for 2021. On the downside, the fuel economy in that hybrid system is a little disappointing in real-world driving. It slots somewhere between the RAV4 hybrid and the Nissan Rogue in terms of real-world fuel economy. Next up, we have the Chevy Equinox, which has one of the lowest starting prices in this segment at $23,800 at the moment. There are also a ton of deals on the hood of the Equinox, and that's likely why the Equinox is beating the Ford Escape when it comes to sales. It's currently the number 3 in this segment. Like the CR-V, the Equinox is one of the older entries in this segment, and it does show when you take a look at the drivetrain lineup. We have a standard 1.5-liter turbocharged engine, very much like we find in the CR-V, but it produces less power, 170 horsepower, and it's mated to a 6-speed automatic transmission, not the newer General Motors 9-speed auto. Because sales of the optional 2-liter turbo were pretty low, only about 7% of Equinox sales, General Motors decided to kill it off for 2021. So if you want that 2-liter turbo in your Equinox, you'd better act fast. You might be able to find a 2020 model year vehicle. That engine was mated with a 9-speed automatic, but for some reason, most likely cost, the 1.5-liter turbo gets the older 6-speed auto. There were rumors that the Equinox might get a refresh for 2021, but that didn't end up happening, likely because of the ongoing pandemic that may have been pushed out to 2022. So in 2022, we might find a few updates, but at the moment, there's just one engine on offer. The diesel has also gone off into the woods. The Equinox has a very roomy interior. Legroom is very similar to the CR-V and the Rogue. The base model is relatively inexpensive, but we don't find the same level of standard equipment that we find in the Nissan Rogue, so definitely keep that in mind. You should also know that the cargo area is oddly small, even though the Equinox is on the larger side of this segment. Next up, we have the Ford Escape, which starts at $24,885. Like the Chevy and the Nissan, there are going to be a decent number of deals on the dealer lot, so definitely keep that in mind, especially as we start getting into the new model year. With this generation of the Escape, Ford decided to go with a more passenger car style. So if you aren't liking the mini truck styling that we see in really most of the competition, you might want to take a look at the Ford Escape. If, on the other hand, you prefer something a little bit more rugged looking, a little bit boxier shaped, you might want to wait for the upcoming Bronco Sport. The reason that Ford decided to style the Escape in this particular direction, a little bit more like the Ford Fusion, is because the Bronco Sport is coming out very soon. And so if you want the more passenger car looking crossover, that's going to be the Escape. If you want the boxier one, that's going to be the Bronco Sport. In this generation, the Escape has a pretty decent amount of legroom, but beware, Ford's legroom calculations are a little bit unusual. Ford is one of the few auto manufacturers out there that calculates their legroom figures a little bit differently than most competitors, and that leads to slightly larger numbers. If you're really considering the Ford Escape and you are planning on putting child seats in the back or folks with longer legs, you should probably take a trip to the Ford dealer, stuff everybody in the vehicle, make sure everybody is happy and that they fit before you sign on that dotted line. On the other hand, the Escape's cargo area is on the large side of this segment, and we have a hybrid system and a plug-in hybrid system available if that's something that you're interested in. Bottom line, there are a ton of great compact crossovers right now in the United States, and we're a little bit spoiled for choice, to be honest. The Nissan Rogue has a great style to it. I love the interior. I love the comfort level that we find in the seats, but there are definitely going to be some solid reasons to buy, for instance, the Toyota RAV4 Hybrid. If I were shopping in this segment right now and I didn't have kids in rear-facing child seats, I might take a look at that RAV4 Hybrid simply because of its excellent fuel economy. I don't think it's as attractive or as comfortable inside and out as the Nissan Rogue. It's certainly not as roomy inside, but it is going to give you 40 miles per gallon in real-world driving. If, on the other hand, you're looking for one of the easiest to live with crossovers that's handsome and has a very comfortable interior, quite logically, the Nissan Rogue is going to be an excellent fit. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section, and what would you pick if you were shopping in this segment right now. Be sure and head over to AOAmerch.com to get all of your latest AOA merch, including shirts right like this one, and strange table lamps right like the one that is next to me, in case you're interested. You'll find all of that over at AOAmerch.com. You can also head over to Facebook.com/AlexNautos to see what I'm driving this week, and Instagram as well if you want to see the lighter side of things. I'll see all of you later.